Dear friends, dear guests, hello, good evening. Welcome to the beginning of another lecturing course that we're going to introduce to you now. It is my pleasure and my honor to introduce to you our distinguished speaker. I know some of you know this person by actual experience of being taught by him, but I also know that there are people who see us all here for the first time. So I would like to say a few words about the professor who's going to be teaching to you on a very interesting topic to my mind, which is how to be a practical CEO. I want to introduce to you Mr. Stewart Lawson, who is currently Executive Director of Ernst & Young in Russia, and I'd like to say a couple of words about his biography, which I find extremely rich and interesting. Just to read quickly before the lecture, I'm sure that you'll understand more about how this kind of rich experience makes a really interesting person and a lecturer. Mr. Stewart Lawson was born in London and graduated from Oxford University, and his career is largely a career of a banker. He's been based in various countries. He spent quite a few years in London being an executive officer at Citibank in London, as I understand, but it's interesting that the bulk of his career was in other countries being in banking and also in Russia. And I was very interested to know that Mr. Lawson was practically involved in the development and establishment banking system in our country and became president of Citibank when this bank, as I understand, came into our country in 1995, and also repeatedly was awarded the prize Russia's best banker, which I think is quite interesting to point out. So as I understand, this course will be largely a practice-oriented course which will combine lecturing plus the case-oriented studies, and also, as I understand, Mr. Lawson will be inviting some very interesting people to this course, so it will be an interesting experience for you in terms of getting to know not just the way this practice is done at Ernst & Young, but also in other large companies here in Russia. So I wish you all good luck, and I envy you this experience, which unfortunately I won't be able to share in, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be back. I have to say I missed you, those of you I know, and I will miss you, those of you I haven't met yet. I guess the summer's a good time to sort of let off steam and be somewhere else. I did a bit of that as well, and I'm really ready to spend the next 6 or 7 weeks with you on Mondays talking about what I know about how to be a CEO, leadership, skills, some of the issues that I've run across. And as was being mentioned, you know, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to introduce you to some of the people that I know in Russia, some of the CEOs that I know. My plan is to try and make the guest speakers as varied as possible. Because you see, being a CEO or being a leader, it's very interesting to me. If you look at people that do this, they're all different, but they all have some similar characteristics. And so what I would like us to do over this period is to, I'll be sitting in the audience and I'll be asking some questions. And the plan is to try and see if we can spot the similarities between the various people that come to talk to us. They will all, I won't tell them that that's what we're doing. I'll try and keep each one sort of insulated so that they actually come to the class and they're completely open and don't realize that we're actually trying to find these trends. But for each evening where we have a speaker, what we'll do is we'll sit together a little bit beforehand or perhaps after, I haven't worked it out, and we'll go through what we're trying to look for and whether or not we're going to be able to see it. This is an experiment for me, and so what I'm really looking for is your feedback as we go along as to what works, what doesn't work for you, because the point here is to pass on knowledge. This is not, you're not going to come out of this class with an exercise book full of interesting facts. You know, hopefully if I'm successful, you will come out of this class with a series of insights, maybe a bit more understanding. And, you know, as I said, I think when some of us met before, I'm not expecting you all to be CEOs. And actually, please don't try and all be CEOs, because it doesn't suit everybody. But what I would hope is that some of the things that we talk about during this period should be of interest to you, and that's what we'll try and develop. I'm just going to very quickly say that for those people that don't know me, if I look at my life, my 36 years in banking, first of all, it seems like an extremely long time. But secondly, it's 16 years in Russia out of a 36-year career. You know, that means that I have an enormous interest in this country. And, you know, yes, I suppose I do feel that I was involved at the outset of the development of the banking industry here, because actually I was. You know, when I set up Citibank in '95, there weren't any bankers in the country. Now, of course, that's not completely true. There were some bankers, but many of the bankers that were around in '95 had been communist bankers, socialist bankers. Of course, if you went to Sberbank today and you said, oh, you're all a bunch of communist bankers, it's ridiculous, because they're not. Although I should expect in some branches, in some departments, there are plenty of people who were doing some banking 30 years ago. But the fact is that as we opened the doors of Citibank, we were faced with a really big issue. We couldn't hire, really, experienced bankers, because experienced bankers in the Soviet system didn't care about their customers. You know, if you have a monopoly and you're inside a communist environment, and I've actually worked inside a monopoly in a communist environment, because I worked in Cuba. And I had the opportunity in Cuba to actually experience this system. And if you are a client of a communist bank in a Soviet system, in a Soviet-style system, you don't have an alternative. You're going to wait in line for as long as they want. You're going to do exactly what they want, and you're going to accept their terms and conditions, because there's no alternative. Well, if you're on the inside of that system, obviously you're not about to develop an understanding for how to please the customer. You're not going to understand a system of how to be competitive, because it isn't necessary. So you see, back in 1995, we actually had to do two things. We had to hire bright young Russians who were keen, enthusiastic, but knew nothing about banking. And we had to marry them with experienced bankers from other parts of the world who knew a lot about banking and nothing about Russia. And actually, a lot of the people that we brought here in '95 didn't want to be here in '95 or any other year. I mean, in other words, it was a real management challenge. It's very interesting to me now when I look around in Russia and I look at the banking system. I'll give you just one example. Anton Karamazin. Anybody know who Anton Karamazin is? Probably not. He's the CFO of a small bank called Sberbank. And he was my assistant finance controller. He was the guy who was the junior guy who would prepare the presentations. And now, 15 years later, he's one of the most accomplished bankers in the market, controlling 30% of the assets. And to me, that, if you said to me, Stuart, what are you proud of in your career? I would say that perhaps the thing that makes me feel the best is knowing that people that I worked with 15 years ago have been able to grow in such a way that they've been able to really demonstrate tremendous capacity. And that they have done, and this is where I want to introduce a concept, they have developed skills, but you know, skills aren't enough. They've developed characteristics that have made them leaders. And it is a core part of this course that I want to teach you, is that you need to learn the skills, because without them you won't be effective. But if you don't learn the characteristics, having the skills isn't enough. So as you go through your, and by the way, I mean, I'm sorry to sound like an old man, but I guess I am an old man, so I'm allowed to sound that way. You may not understand it today, but when you look in the rear view mirror over your life, the thing that you will value, I believe, will not be whether or not you're the best PowerPoint presenter, or whether or not you know how to use Excel, or whether you're a terrific lawyer. It will be what characteristics have you developed in your life and in your professional life, and can you look back on those with pride and say, this is who I have become? Because it's the characteristics that make you who you are, not the skills. So, what we're going to do, I'm going to give you an outline of the course, and then we'll use that outline, and next week we'll have our first guest lecturer. And I'll tell you a little bit about him at the end of the session. But we'll have the first opportunity to listen to somebody who I believe is extremely articulate, who's a foreigner, who has built a major business in Russia. So you will have heard some of this before, because those of you that came to my open lecture on how to be a CEO, this is a lot of what I was talking about. You know, the role of a CEO, and the reason why we talk about leadership and being a CEO, is a CEO is not a manager. It was one of the mistakes that I made the first time I was given a leadership role. I didn't understand that there is this fundamental gap between a role of a manager and the role of a leader. You see, one of the problems that big corporations face often is that they promote their best managers. So, and of course they do, because, you know, they're faced with a group, normally, let's call it 20 people, and they have to make a decision. Which of these 20 people are we going to promote and make a leader? Well, they look at their performance, they look at the facts, they look at, you know, how much money they made for the business, how much they've achieved, and often they will choose the guy who has been the most effective. And you know what? I was that guy. I came to Russia from Italy, and in Italy we faced complete disaster as Citibank, because in Italy in 1993, all the senior management, well, I say all, most of the senior management of Italian companies was put in jail because they'd been corrupted by the politicians who'd been in power for too long. And our clients were suddenly, all the management of those clients was being ripped out and put into jail. And we had one particular company that had a huge fraud called Ferruzzi. And the owner of that, well, it was a major, they had borrowed an enormous amount of money from Citibank, and one day that owner, a very handsome playboy, committed suicide. Not a good move if you're lending money to a company where the guy who owns the company just commits suicide. So suddenly we had a headless company, a shareholder. It was a company, actually it had public shareholders, but the main driving force in that company had disappeared. And it was my job to go down to Italy from London and take control of the situation. And you know, I did that in a way that I had become truly expert at. I was Citibank's leading crisis manager. You know, I say that now, and of course there may be some people at Citibank that say, no, you weren't. I was. But the fact is that I was the guy they used around the world in 4 or 5 countries to solve their problems. And sure enough, I solved their problems. I took no prisoners. You have no idea how tough I can be if I want to have my way. If you think you can sit there and do nothing, I'll tell you now that you're going to do exactly what I want, and you'll do it by this time, and you'll do it in this way. And anybody that doesn't like that can leave now. That's how charming I was. Okay? Except I did that for years, and I did that a lot louder. And I used people up. I just used people up. And I was extremely effective. So they gave me the big new job to be a leader. Well, the only problem with this, what's the problem with this? What's the problem with this as a concept? I was effective as a manager. Do you think I was going to be effective as a leader? No, of course not. Leadership is not shouting at people. It's not telling people that they have to do this by this time. It's not intimidation. It's not directional, forcing people, this is the way you do it or else. Threats in leadership don't work. If you can't get people to believe in you and they don't follow you willingly, it is an extremely inefficient process. Because at some point, if you force the pace like that, you will encounter opposition. People internalize. You can insult people once. You can humiliate people once. Try doing it again, and a wall of resentment builds up. Leadership is about getting people to buy into your vision and having people want to follow you. Not fear following you, not fear the alternative, but actually want to follow you. So I'm going to talk a lot more about leadership over the course of 6 weeks, but the reason I've chosen this as a subject, how to be a CEO, is because part of being a CEO, a major part of being a CEO, is how to create leadership. And in this business of how to create leadership, the gap between skills and characteristics is critical, and I'll talk about that in detail. Also, whenever you get something to do, you have to understand who the important people are for you. And that doesn't mean to say, who's your family and friends. It means who are the people that control your ability to continue doing whatever it is that somebody's asked you to do. So who are the constituents? And this it comes down to what do they want and from who. Now, if we get time, I'd like to run you through the sort of thing that you would do as your first day as a CEO, just to give you a feeling, a sort of actual feeling of what's involved. And I'm going to obviously use what it's like to be the CEO of a bank, but what I'm hoping is you'll get enough out of it that you'll see the breadth. I mean, it's a bit like when I was talking about risk. When I talked about risk, I talked about the broad spectrum of risk. Because risk isn't something that you put in a little box and you manage the little box called risk. It's about all those different types of risk that you face. And in the same way, being a CEO doesn't have a single strand to it. You will have, and I'll show you in a minute, a very broad range of things that you need to do. And those require skills and characteristics. And then we'll talk a bit about what can go wrong, because it often does. So I've talked here about being a leader, not a manager. Now, by the way, you'll have to forgive me. Those of you who've heard the stories before, you're going to hear them twice, not once. So just bear with me. I won't actually remember which ones I've told you before. So try and look as though you're still enjoying them. When I lost my job at Citibank in Russia, which of course I did, because I was too busy using people up. I was too busy telling people what to do as if I was still a manager and I wasn't trying to lead them. It's not that easy, by the way. Don't think that this is because I'm some bad guy and I didn't know what I was doing. I was doing the best I could do. But when I was told that, okay, you just haven't connected, it was, by the way, never a problem with Russians. It was a problem with the expatriates that worked for me. When I was told, okay, you're going to be reassigned, I said, well, listen, I really need to go and see my boss's boss. I want to appeal the decision. And I flew to London, and I was allowed 2.5 hours with my boss's boss. By the way, you just got to picture the scene. This was before 9/11. I landed in London, but I hadn't thought about this. My boss's boss, was traveling between Prague and Sydney. Well, I've now landed in arrivals, he's in departures. Got a little problem here. I haven't got a ticket to go anywhere, but he's sitting in the departures lounge, I'm sitting in the arrivals. Because it was 9/11, before 9/11, and because I was desperate, I was simply able to walk through. No ticket, just turned up in the departures lounge. I wouldn't want to try and do that today. And I sat down with him, and he spent a very generous 2 hours with me. Now, one of the things he said to me that I really remember, you know, I look at the guy, I can see the guy's face, and I can hear him telling me this. He said, when you were a gladiator, every time somebody took out their sword, you had to take out your sword because you were a gladiator. And you would have to go out into the forum and you would fight them. And you'd fight them with logic, you'd fight them with intimidation, you'd fight them with whatever tools you had, because you had to combat them directly. He said, now you are Caesar. You're sitting in the box, you're looking at the forum. Every time you see a gladiator, if you pull out your sword, you're no longer Caesar, you're another gladiator. And the fact is that when you move into this leadership role, if you hold on to all of the things that have got you that far because you feel the need for confrontation and that you need to win those arguments, you immediately lose credibility as a leader. And it's that ability to put distance between the day-to-day management, the day-to-day conflict of management, because, by the way, management, it would be nice if everybody could sort of live in a Google campus and play ping pong and foosball all day long and somehow reach, you know, creative ideas in a sort of consensus way. But the fact is that it doesn't work like that. There are conflicts, people don't agree, and, you know, particularly if you're a change agent, by definition, people won't agree. If you arrive and you're a change agent, what's one of the things you have to do? Well, you have to change things. And as you change things, people will resist that change. And by the way, the bigger the change, the more resistant. The older the institution, the more the resistance. The stronger the culture, and by heavens, I've worked in some very strong cultures, the greater the resistance. So as a change agent, you're always going to face opposition. And the difference between being a manager and a leader is that you can't afford to pull your sword out as a leader. And that's a lesson that I needed 2 more roles as CEOs before I truly understood it. The next is that you need to provide strategic direction. Now, strategic direction is about looking at the day after tomorrow. It's about looking at the horizon. It's the difference between tactics and strategy. If you are not, as the CEO, looking at the long-term development of the company, the long-term threats to the company, the long-term development of people, you're not doing your job. Because you're surrounded by managers whose tactical job is to get you from here to where you need to go next. As a leader and a CEO, you have to think past that. Of course you have to deal with today's problems. Because if you just ignored today's problems and said, well, I'm too busy being a strategic leader to worry about the fact that there's a fire in the basement, well, you know, that will eventually burn down the building. But you can't be distracted every day by short-term issues. Those of you that were with me last term will remember, don't let the urgent crowd out the important. Because it always will if you let it. So, long-term critical issues. and we can talk a bit about what strategy really is. I talked quite a lot about being a risk manager. There isn't somebody in the building called a risk manager. You can't, well, there is, of course. There is somebody called a risk manager. But if you think that they're responsible for all risk in your business, you're going to miss, I don't know, 80% of the risks that you will face. The risk manager, just to put it in context, the risk manager of your business is not responsible for PR. But PR is a major risk. So if you define all risk as being the guy in the cubicle that's responsible for financial risk management, you're going to miss, just by example, all of that PR risk, which, by the way, can be far worse than financial risk. Or at least PR risk can become financial risk very quickly if you're not careful. You're the spokesperson for the company. People identify the company with you. If you are the CEO and you make a statement, even an unguarded statement, you are representing the company. And you know what? Anybody here a journalist? Are there any journalists in the room? Is that why you're taking notes? You know what you people do? You wait like jackals in the corners of conferences, and we give speeches that we're very careful, and we work out exactly what we want to say and what the key messages and everything, and we talk about it with our PR people, and then as we're leaving, just as we're leaving, a charming young man like you or somebody similar comes up and says, Mr. Lawson, just before you leave, do you mind one last quick word? And because you're full of, pride or arrogance, you're pleased with yourself because you gave a great speech. You say, of course, young man, I'd love to have a word. What would you like to talk about? Well, Mr. Lawson, we were wondering if you could comment. And then the first question is always an easy one, okay, to sucker you in. We were just wondering, Mr. Lawson, how it is that you've been so successful in your career. Why is it that the central bank awarded you the best Russian banker award 4 years in a row? And then we're caught, and we're relaxed, and we say, well, actually, I'm glad you asked, and we spend 10 minutes giving you an answer that you immediately forget. And then, while we're feeling good, you just ask one more question. Well, Mr. Lawson, and what do you think about the Hermitage crisis and the death of Magnitsky, for instance? And then your defenses are down, and you say something, and there it is in black and white, and you can't roll it back. It's out. Every photograph you people put on Facebook, you better feel comfortable with when you're 60, because they're still going to be there. So this business of PR risk, we can spend a whole class on it. Maybe we'll find a way of doing that. You're the arbiter of the senior management team. Any business is only as good as its management. Show me a business that says the numbers rule. I'll show you an accident about to happen. There's no such thing as a business outside of management. The numbers reflect what management decides. It's not the other way around. So if you agree with me on that, and if you're the CEO and if you have to make those decisions, then your role deciding your team is probably the single most important thing you'll do. It may not be. You may be able to make some mistakes that blow up the company. But if you put the wrong person into the wrong job, they'll blow up the company for you. And by the way, all of these issues, I wish they were simple because, well, actually, I'm glad they're not. Otherwise, I'd have nothing to tell you. But when I say you're the arbiter of the management team, I'm not saying that there are the good guys in the white hats and the bad guys in the black hats, and all you have to do is work out which guy wears which hat. Because people wear both hats several times a day. and they wear them depending on who they're talking to. So you can have a good guy who's good with smart young people and bad with people that aren't so smart. And you can have a guy who's terrific with people who aren't so smart but absolutely can't manage when he feels confronted by people that are smarter than he is. And people's reaction changes according to their environment. So it isn't just that you pick the guys with the black and white hats. It's also how you're feeling on the day. Depends on how you can react. And so this business of being the arbiter of senior management is complicated. I'll give you another example of why. I mean, I can spend days. We can lock the doors and you'll be forced to listen to me for days. Another example. You have the best guy. This guy, the best guy in the room. Clearly the best guy, smart, engaged. And the only trouble with this guy is that you put him in any sort of team environment and it's all about him. He can't stand competition. Well, it's worse than that. He will shine like a star. And he'll be very good. He'll be, as long as he's as long as it's within his direct control, he'll be very good. The moment you want to leverage him, it all falls apart. Dealing with the star regime, as I call it, the guys who are brilliant but just can't manage in that sort of an environment, is probably one of the most difficult things you have to do, because they're sort of like drugs. You love them, because you say, hey, do this, it's done. Do this, it's done. Do this, it's done. The only problem is that the damage that they're doing by creating the apparent efficiency, is enormous. So getting stars to work in teams is a whole topic all by itself. And by the way, I was a star. I was a really big star. I was, when I did leverage buyouts, which was from 88 to 93, I did more than anybody else. I made sure of that. I did bigger deals. I did them quicker. I did them with more profitability. I did them any which way was better than everybody else. The only problem is nobody else wanted to deal with me eventually. But I was very good technically at what I did. So getting good stars to work in teams, key. I was not uniformly bad. I want you to know. A controlled environment, you can't say you're running anything unless you're inside a controlled environment. So you can't pretend to be the CEO of something if you don't control the environment you're in. Now, having a controlled environment is sort of like, cleaning out the drains. It's not for everybody, and it's a very specific system, and it's a very specific set of responsibilities, and some people really, it doesn't suit them. But you have to have the people that want to clean out the drains in the business. Because without this controlled environment, whatever you set up to do will fall apart. There's this whole thing of, do people obey rules because they instinctively want to obey rules, or do they obey rules because it's in their self-interest? And generally, you have to create self-interest, and the only way you can create self-interest is by creating penalties for not following the rules. And the only way you can do that is by internal control, by credit, by audit, by these elements by policies, practices, and procedures that define what is acceptable behavior within the organization called the business. Now, you know what? I sort of really don't want to stand here and lecture you for an hour and 20 minutes every night, because, I've got plenty to download. I've got plenty of things I can download, but I would really prefer if we could get a little interaction going. So before we move on to this, I want to talk. Oh, actually, we don't. Yeah. Well, we don't have a flipboard. Actually, Dimitri, can I get next time round? Can I get a flipboard, because I'd like to put things up. So, going around the room, ladies and gentlemen, Can you tell me who your favorite leader was and why? You can spend a minute thinking. Who was your favorite leader and why? You're not limited to the current leaders. You can choose any leader from history. Actually, you can choose a leader from Star Trek. I mean, it doesn't worry me. Captain Kirk, maybe. Doesn't matter what field, any field. Can be military, can be sport. But you have to have an idea why they're your favorite leader. Yeah. No, your favorite leader. No, absolutely a personal thing. I mean, you need to be able, as you put your hand up, why don't you go first? It can be somebody that's special to you, but you have to be able to explain why that person was a great leader for you. So who do you choose? Patient. Is that it's in Moscow or it's in Russia? Oh, okay. Do you think she has to be impatient with the authorities? Do you think she has to be impatient with, in other words, patience is a great virtue, but when you want to make things happen, do you think she was patient when she was setting up the school? She was hard but patient. Yeah, no. The reason I say that is that because I think I think you've described somebody, but you also described somebody who started something from scratch. Yeah, she started the school, and so she at some point must have, you talk about polite, kind, emotional, patience, all these wonderful, warm terms, but there must be something else as well. She must be hard as well sometimes. Demanding. No, that's fine. No, I think that's fine. Because you see, one of the things that you've described in this leadership, in this leader, is something that I think is critical for a lot of leaders, which is emotional intelligence. We'll talk about that later, but simply having hard skills, and even sometimes simply having skills that people, sorry, not skills, characteristics that people associate with hard leadership, what I call hard leadership, sometimes aren't enough. If you don't have compassion, if you don't have understanding, then these will actually limit your capacity down the road. So, and I love the fact that it's a personal leader. Sure. Who's got another one? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's a discoverer in all of the beginnings of the launched the tape out of the first one famous pictures, and he launched first one motor is the first race puzzler to reach the speed of the normal car, but this is the electricity and now he remember all the models for his work. So he is driven by the ideal that not about money but about the future, how it's easy. He does not only dream about it, he makes it possible in that sense.
Brilliant, yeah. So he really is a perfect example of long-term strategic thinking, but with an ability to execute. Because I think the trick is not just having big ideas, exactly as you say. You can have all the big ideas in the world, but actually To make them happen is another thing. You know, I think... Are we recording this, Dimitri? Or is there no... We're not recording. We are recording. Ah, wonderful. Okay, well, I'm not about to tell the story I was about to tell. Okay, no, I can tell a story, but I'll just disguise it a bit. Somebody I know quite well has had a long-term ambition of doing a book of photographs. And it's a wonderful idea. It's a brilliant concept. I have spoken to them about it for 15 years, and we are no closer today than we were 15 years ago. And the concept is great, all of the ideas around it are great, but the ability to execute and actually do the next thing that makes that long-term goal happen simply isn't there. And so it's that combination of having a long-term objective, strategic view, and being able to actually break it down and make it actionable. Who has another one? Who has another one? Come on. Oh, you don't want me? Yeah. Yeah, he's given a lot of it away. He's thought a lot of it. Well, okay. I mean that this business of being adaptive is another key characteristic, which is that if you're too rigid, if you're not able to understand the cultural context, if you're not able to adjust your way of being to the environment in which you find yourself, no matter how many skills you've got, you see, skills are only as good as the means by which you can actually utilize them. I may know everything there is to know about astrophysics, but if I'm not able to get people to actually get up and do things, by the way, I don't know anything about astrophysics, but if I'm not able to actually cause people to do things, because I'm culturally aware and I'm able to then, so I have to have a couple of things before I can make execution happen. One is that I've got to have long-term vision. Two, I've got to be able to take my understanding and make it fit within a cultural context, or a society context, or an organizational context. I know I told the story, I'll tell a quick story about, when I arrived at Soyuz Bank and it was a Soviet organization, I had to understand what that meant. And it was only after I understood that I needed to sign propusks, not propusks, but protocols, that I caused the organization to change because I used the organization against itself. That was a cultural environment. I mean, it wasn't cultural because it was from France and I was from Italy. It was cultural because it had a certain way of doing things. And so when you talk about Catherine the Great being able to adapt to the Russian court, and then she was effective. But if she hadn't, well, the most basic is if you don't learn the language, you can't communicate. That's sort of 101. But past that, you have to understand the cultural, the things that work culturally and the things that don't work culturally. Yes, well, that's the top end of politics. That, by the way, is another thing that I resolutely ignored during my career. I basically was my own little bulldozer. Mr. Stewart was going to do it Mr. Stewart's way, and he wasn't going to worry about the consequences. And I was good enough at doing that for a long time. I was very successful with it. But ultimately, you need supporters. Now, the people that I really can't take are the people who only know how to be politicians. Those people, who just know how to be nice to the boss and, look good in a suit and not really have substance to them, they are very good at these social things, but not perhaps actually have any skills. And that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is somebody that has all the skills, but none of the social capacity to interact and therefore make people want that person to be successful. How about one more, and then we'll move on. One more leader? Yep. Who's this? Ah. I'm sure it is. Uh-huh. That that business of creating teams and causing people to work together, I think, one of the things that you have to understand, another thing that, there's all these things you have to understand. Well, you don't have to understand them. I mean, you can ignore most of what I say because it's only one man's view. But one of the things I think really is important is how much you can leverage your time. If you are an engraver and your job is to engrave, no matter how good you are, you can only engrave a certain number of objects in a day. Your role as you grow, you may decide that that's what you want to do, and that's a specialist, a true specialist, somebody who hand paints, somebody who actually, if you hand paint, you can only paint one painting. If you're Andy Warhol, you can produce a massive quantity because you're no longer an individual doing one thing. But this business in business of being able to leverage your personal capacity is something that you'll find very important. And you can only leverage your personal capacity by this business of causing other people to follow you. And by the way, it's not really a good thing if everybody follows just one person, which of course I'm afraid to say a lot of Russian culture likes. They like the one strong leader and we'll all follow him. But the problem with the one strong leader and we'll all follow him is you've got to get to that one strong leader. That one strong leader has to make all the decisions. They end up with a span of control issue. And because people aren't listening to their deputies, they're just waiting for the one strong man to make the decision, you end up with stasis. You end up with the situation like a log jam because people can't get to the one strong leader that's going to make all the decisions. So a wise leader is somebody that is able, A, to establish the leadership, which is the ability, the fact that people want to follow him, but as importantly, that people feel empowered to be able to take their own initiative, to create their own teams, because at that point he's able to take his direction and leverage his time, because he doesn't have the time to go out and make every single decision. So this business of causing teams to happen, to create teamwork, is not a simple thing, by the way, is tremendously valuable. I think what I'd like, I'm not going to set homework yet, but I'd like you to, those that didn't speak up about it, I'd like you to think about who are the people that you regard as leaders and why. And then what I'll do is for each session, please, those people that spoke don't speak again, those people that haven't spoke, please give me some ideas, and we'll do 4 or 5 for each of our sessions. And we finish at 8:20, is that right? That's the plan? Is that the deal? Yeah, okay. I talked about letting go of control. Inspirational, not directional. Culturally, and we were talking about culturally, I'm not sure that works incredibly well, as well in Russia as it does in other countries. By the way, whenever I talk about cultural context, one of the things you have to understand about me is that I worked in 11 countries. Now, if you work in 11 countries, you can't afford to be bigoted, you can't afford to have prejudice, you can't afford to carry your world with you. Because I've spent most of my life in somebody else's world. And if I carried my prejudice with me, I'd have a pretty lonely life. I would have had a pretty lonely life. So when I say something like, I think that's more difficult in Russia, it's not because I think, oh, Russians, they don't know what they're doing. I'm just reflecting my observation of Russian culture, which is that you tend to be more directional. You prefer more direction. Obviously, everybody wants to be inspired. But in some environments, inspiration has relatively greater weight than others. And I'm here in Russia, my experience anyway, has been directional still. It's one of the countries where directional leadership is still quite prevalent. Body language counts. You know, no, I'm really happy to see you. No, really, I'm really happy. You can't do that. You can't do that. People, and again, I have to say, particularly in Russia, people read what your body says. Now, you can, of course, people can create, people go on body language courses and they exude, I mean, if you look at, politicians, I mean, it just drives me nuts. We go forward, we go back, I embrace you. I mean, all of this stuff you can see. And of course, if you turn the volume off, watch some of the, of course, when they're doing a political debate, as they're doing, in America now, their hands are rigidly on the side of the podium. One of the things you're taught on TV, never move your hands, because you look like an idiot. If you're giving a speech and you're going forward and backwards and all of this stuff, then you use your hands much more. But if you're in a studio discussion, keep your hands firmly cemented somewhere. But people, I mean, there are obvious things. I remember going to the Central Bank of Egypt and crossing my legs and presenting the sole of my foot to the governor of the central bank. Not a very clever idea. I mean, I could have told him to do something to his mother, but I was essentially doing the same thing with my foot. So that's a cultural thing. But I'm talking about just as you sit, as you interact with people, if you sit back and you cross your arms, and there's a well-known Russian personality in a position of some power, who always, instead of sitting, he slumps. He slumps against the seat like this. It's sort of like, entertain me. And that is on so many levels. It's such a, and of course, it is combined with a sense of entitlement and power, because it doesn't work otherwise. Because his message is, I'm far more important than you are. I'm going to slump here and you're going to do whatever you're going to do to impress me. Now that could well be, you can use body language as power. What you're doing is you're giving a message by your body language. But there's intended and unintended body language. And be sure that you don't create unintended body language, because that will definitely work against you. Sorry, was that are you a question or are you holding your pen up? Okay, fine. It's body language. Sorry, please ask questions, because as I say, otherwise I'm up here. And any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah, sure. So the question is, if I think Russia's directional, not inspirational, where is inspirational, not directional? Sorry, England is inspirational. In England, you can have a big idea, the Olympics. I mean, Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, he's inspirational. People want to follow him. And the concept of delegation in England is very well developed. In other words, people, if you put an easy way of describing this, if you put a group of people, which I used to do in a room in London, and you give them a task, and you say, this is what I want us to do, generally, it would be very unusual for somebody to say, but what do you want to do? I'd say, well, okay, this is what I'd like you to do. I'd then leave the room, they'd have a discussion, you'd come back and they'd tell you. If you do that not in a modern, not in a very forward-thinking Russian environment, but if you could do that in a sort of an old-style environment, you'd say, I'd like you to think about this problem, and there'd be a pause, and then somebody would say, but what do you want us to do? They would look for that direction. And there is a sense of, we want to please you, rather than this is what we think we should do, and this is our value-added, contribution. America is another example. Actually, you can take this too far, so that you end up where you have inverted pyramids. Sorry. So do you see the point? I just remembered a story I wanted. I was going to come and talk on Dignity Day. You have Dignity Day on Wednesday. Anybody know about that? It's for schools. It's a worldwide initiative to get kids to think about dignity as a concept, and I think it's a great idea. And so they asked me to come to. Actually, it was going to be at Imgimo. One of the classes from a local school was coming, and you had to tell a story about dignity. And I spent some time thinking about, well, what's a good story about dignity? I'm doing this now because my class on Wednesday got cancelled. So you're my class on dignity. Sorry, got nothing to do with leadership. So here's a story. I was in Cairo with my son. My son is 14 now. He was 12 or 11 then. It was just before the Arab Spring. It was just before the riots. We were there 10 days before Egypt got going. And we were staying in a hotel. I'd taken him all around Cairo because I knew Cairo quite well because I'd lived there for a while. And he comes from Atlanta. My son comes from Atlanta, doesn't know anything about the emerging markets. So I gave him an opportunity to see how other people live. Well, it was the day of departure. And I'd had a big night the night before. I think it was New Year's Eve or the day after New Year's Eve. And I knew what time we were leaving. I knew what flight it was. I was in the center of Cairo. And suddenly I realized that I got the time wrong. And I had 45 minutes to get to the airport. Well, anybody that knows Cairo knows that if you're in Zamalek, there's no way you're getting to the airport, in 45 minutes. I ran downstairs. I grabbed the first cab I could find. I dragged my son along. He was kind of kicking and screaming. We get in the cab. We start towards the airport. We're 45 minutes down the road. Thank God the plane was delayed, by the way, so we did actually fly away. But we were 45 minutes down the road. I had left 2 jackets in the hotel room, expensive jackets that I'd put hanging up. You must have all done this at some point. If you haven't done it now, you will have done it at some point. Just trust me, you will at some point leave something behind in a hotel room. Anyway, so what am I going to do? I can't go back. The flight's about to leave. I've got a taxi driver. I've never met him before. We're in an old Egyptian taxi. I give him $100. And I give him the address of my club in London. And I said, could you please go back to the hotel, ask the concierge for my jackets, and I wrote a note saying this man is authorized to take my jackets, and post them with DHL I think I may have given him $200, actually, I'll tell them. But post them to me in London. And I turned to my son and I said, you're about to get a lesson in life, because it is my belief that those jackets will turn up. A week went by, nothing. 10 days later, my club calls me up. What do you want us to do with the jackets? Now, the guy driving the taxi knew for a fact he was never going to see me again. He absolutely was never going to see me again. I didn't have his name. I didn't try and take his passport number. I mean, I knew it was ridiculous. I just gave him the money. But he had personal dignity. And he was going to do what he said he was going to do because of that personal dignity. So there's my dignity story. But it's, you know, and my son learned a lesson, which was very important to me. Okay. There you go. See, this is what happens if you don't ask me questions. You get to be, you know, you get my little stories, you know. So who's got a question? Yep. No questions? Really? Okay. Did everybody get that? I mean, it's one thing to be an aggressive change agent leader, which is what I was. It's another thing to be an Ernst & Young leader on a transaction or an audit or something, a manager on a transaction or an audit, where many of the characteristics of a good manager are going to be characteristics of a good leader. And I completely agree. I mean, I think there's something else that is perhaps self-evident. We are all reflections of our past history. So everybody sort of sees things. Now, it's probably not right of me to be somebody trying to teach you and then just reflect my personal experience, but it makes it more real for me. So when I say you can't, you run the risk of taking your best manager and making them into a leader and then finding they blow up because management isn't leadership. What I mean is you run that risk if you do that to me. Obviously, there are many managers who have leadership potential, who demonstrate many of the characteristics of leadership, but just at a management level. I think in my defense, it's an extremely good point. I think in my defense, I try and caricature it to make the point, which is that management isn't leadership. But the fact is, of course, to be a good manager in a normalized environment, and one in which you're not imposing, actually even a situation where you are imposing a lot of change, you can do it in lots of ways that do reflect leadership characteristics. It's not, I'm just saying that you can also be a very effective manager in the short term without some of the critical leadership characteristics that you need to develop. That's a much better way, and thank you for pulling me up on that, because I think that's very important clarification. Yep, good. This is why I asked for questions, by the way. Yes? Say again? What was a country? Well, which is the most? A country where body language is the most important? I would say actually Russia's right up there. You know, the number of times, and again, I fall into the risk of just giving you a personal experience. By the way, none of this is, I mean, I shouldn't really say this because I'm in an academic environment. None of this has been academically researched by a team of experts, and this is the answer. This is Mr. Lawson giving you his personal experience, so bear that in mind. But the number of times that I've been to my office when I was CEO, when my assistant has warned, I found this out afterwards, she's warned people he's looking in a bad mood, don't go and ask him any questions. or he seems to be in a good mood, you better go in now. The reaction to frankly, how I sit. I had an office. I always have offices. I don't have one anymore because I don't need one like this. But when I was running organizations, I would always have an office big enough to have 3 parts to it. A desk, bless you, a conference table, and a sofa area. Because according to the meeting, you want to project power from behind the desk. So if I don't get up from behind the desk and you come in and you have to sit in one of the seats in front of me, I'm making a statement. I'm the boss, you're my subordinate, you're going to listen to what I'm going to say, and that's the way it's going to be. If we move to the conference table, which was always round, I'm saying I'm one person around a table, of course, maybe with my thumb on the scales, but I'm listening to what other people have to say. And then if I move to the sofa, it was, well, actually, apparently if you were offered coffee, because I have a coffee machine in those offices, if I offered to make you coffee, it meant one of only 2 things. Well, 3. If you were a client, you got coffee. If you were a member of staff, you were either going to get promoted or fired. And people, I'd make the coffee, and then people are like, oh my God, am I going to get promoted or fired? But, so there is an example of, it's a rather sort of dumb example, but it's an example of using physical environment to convey a message. Here's my power, I'm democratic, and this is where I'm going to deliver emotive messages. So, yeah, go ahead. No, of course it doesn't. No. I wasn't suggesting you should do this. I was using it as an example of very basic body language. No, I didn't spend my whole time moving around the office trying to, it's like, now I'm going to be powerful, now I'm going to be, no. I was using it as in a rather basic way to emphasize certain elements of body language, yeah. Yes. Well, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong. I mean, there's some political environments where leaders don't like to have other leaders that are created, let's say. But in a business environment, I think you should be judged by the people that work for you. I think that I think you should look back on, you should be able to look back on your career and see people who have done better than you have, who used to work for you. If you hire midgets, you will never grow. I don't mean midgets physically. If you hire people because you can dominate them, your business will always be constrained. If you hire people who are better than you, they will over time overtake you. But in the process, they will have been allowed you to be successful. I really believe that. And of course, you run the risk that somebody's coming after your job. And that's another, then we have another set of issues to deal with, which is how do you confront aggression in the workplace? How do you manage a guy who has made it his business to be disruptive or to go after your job or to incite, when I say disruptive, I mean incite rebellion. I had a guy, and I'll maybe finish on this topic. One of the things that would happen, I was a change agent, okay? So the only times I turned up, things had fallen apart. It wasn't good if I turned up on your doorstep. And normally the portfolio or the process had fallen apart. Well, actually normally what happened is they'd start taking losses Then they'd send in an audit team. Then they'd discover that management wasn't making the right decisions. Then they'd call me up and they would not replace the boss, which was always, they'd replace the number two, and I'd go in as the number two. And actually part of my attitude part of the reason I became so insubordinate, I guess, is that I was always reporting to the guy above my boss because I'd been put in to change things. But so when I turned up and things had gone wrong and there was kind of a big mess in the room, I had when I say an arbiter of senior management, one of my first questions had to be, who stays, who goes? Because obviously, if there's been a big problem, somebody made that big problem. I mean, if you start from the assumption, which is the one I was trying to suggest earlier, business is just a set of management decisions by people. Okay, you can be unlucky, the world can change on you and everything, but at the end of the day, it would probably mean that somebody around that table had made a mistake. And I had to decide who to keep and who to let go. And I would spend, what I say is, learn from your mistakes. And I didn't for years. Terrible. And I would make the same mistake time and time again, which is that there'd be somebody around the table who disagreed. And I would then spend a huge amount of my effort trying to convince them that I was doing the right thing and their resistance was unnecessary. And you know, Peter Smeder, who's the chairman of Alpha Bank and a good friend of mine, came to speak at one of my other classes. And he said such a wonderful thing, which is so obvious to me now after I heard him, which is, if you spend all your time in the room with the one person that disagrees with you, you're not spending all your time in the room with the other 9 people who agree with you. And so you spend your time pushing on a door that won't open. And yet those other people in the room who are looking for your leadership are being robbed of your time and energy because you spent all your time talking to the guy that disagrees. And I think it would have been a lot better if and eventually I got the point. If you give everybody the same chance, you create equal information, you lay out your strategy, you lay out your rationale, and then you give people the chance. You are either with me or you're not with me. Or as one of my bosses said, the train is leaving the station. You're on it, you're not on it. Now, you don't do that day one, because that is all the bad things that we're talking about in terms of I'm not listening, I'm not taking opinions and so forth. And of course there's room for disagreement. People should be allowed to disagree with you. But there's a big difference between disagreeing and disrupting. And disagreeing is perfectly fine. Disrupting will eventually cause your train to fall off the tracks, because they will affect they will affect all sorts of things. They will affect your authority, because they'll be spending all their time trying to undermine it. They will affect the ability for teamwork, because they will be getting in the way all the time. They will be creating a role model, an anti-role model, as it were, particularly if they're very visible. I had somebody who worked for me in one of the banks who, frankly, was and has gone on to actually be very successful. But he disagreed with a lot of the things that I was doing, and he was strong enough and smart enough that he was really causing me to be unable to move forward. But I always wanted to carry everybody with me. And I think that's a mistake. I think don't misunderstand. This is not about you come in, we're going to do it my way or the highway. No, it's not that. It is that you go in, you give it enough time to assess the situation, you take enough information that you understand where you are, you spend enough time taking opinion, you create a plan, you communicate that plan. One of my key words is communicate. You communicate the plan, and then you say, okay, and now we must move forward. And in a change situation, not everybody will agree, but if they disagree, they have to be at least in your direction, because if they're being disruptive, they will cause a problem. Do you agree? You disagree? You disagree. So. Okay, but that's fine. And yes, and I think this is the sort of the mirror image of your point. Your point being not all good managers are lousy leaders, and your point being not all leaders can afford not to be managers. Yeah. If you are Yes, but you're saying in business you are put into that role. You are named in. Yes. Well, we can have a longer conversation another time. I mean, my last thought, and then we'll break. Different situations require different leadership styles. Now, I believe that the characteristics that we'll talk about next time don't really change, but the way in which they're deployed do change according to the situation. And crisis management is a very particular esoteric part of this process. And leadership in crisis, I would suggest, it involves certain elements that aren't present in a normal business as usual environment. And we can have a debate, and we'll have it, whether or not that's real. So before you go, a couple of things. One, I'm as I think many of you know, I'm on for contact. So if you look up Stewart Lawson on for contact, I'm there. And the reason I'm there is that I want to start communicating. So these sort of issues or disagreements or points that you want me to raise, if you're in the class and you don't want to raise your hand, but you do want to raise them, send me a message, and I will try and incorporate that into my next lecture. The next is that I will put up on the contact page the part of the presentation that I've covered. And I will also be putting up questions that I will want to ask the CEOs when they come. I will intersperse lectures like this with lectures where we bring people in. These are open lectures for IMGMO, aren't they, Dimitri? So anybody who's in IMGMO can come to these events. And if you have friends and family who happen to be in IMGMO, then you can bring them along. No babies, please. Or small dogs. I have samizdat versions of, by which I mean I've just made a photocopy of them, which I probably shouldn't, which is the bit of the tape that we'll be taking out, of a Harvard Business Review on crucible leadership moments, being, it's my experience, all leaders go through a period in which is the equivalent of being in the crucible. Please read them before next week. And then finally there's an article that was written, an interview with me, so that you can ask questions if you disagree with some of the things I said. So please make sure you help yourself to these packages down here, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.